I want to give my bit on open standards versus open source. I've had lots of requests on this, especially post Steve Jobs' letter on the whole Adobe versus Apple and the whole Flash deal. That comes to be from Adobe, according to Steve Jobs' letter, claiming that they were open, when actually they were just claiming they had an open specification. Now, an open specification is not an open standard. Think of a specification like JavaScript. It's simply out there, it can be used, it's not necessarily requiring a governing body or a committee and whatnot. If there is a change, then they release usually another specification, and it's out there for people to use. Now, within Adobe's case, of course, it ultimately leads to a proprietary product in the end. Now, for an open standard, especially using the letter, does not necessarily mean open source. And to use the word proprietary is not necessarily the opposite of an open standard, as an open standard can include something proprietary and something open source. A standard can include specifications, what have you. The idea of it is simple, like a specification to have interoperability. It's a collaboration of efforts to try to make a common denominator, if you will, amongst parties that normally don't have a lot of things in common. A good example to bring up, like cascading style sheets, which has patents that Microsoft enforces, but it's on an agreed, either low-cost licensing basis, what have you. OpenGL is another great example. It's not open source, but it is a standard, nonetheless, that people partake in. They have a committee, and it governs how it then releases its specifications. But licenses are paid to those that hold the ownership of OpenGL itself. So to say that you're using open standards does not make you open as an open source. Now, this doesn't mean that open standards are bad or good. I actually appreciate a lot of open standards, and I advocate OpenGL and OpenAL, and there's LLVM. Now, a lot of these do use open source, and they have other specifications in them. For example, if Apple or any other company is saying we want to use HTML5 and JavaScript, two specifications, and then they also have open source licensing associated with them, like the JavaScript library, for example. Or let's say they include a codec which is proprietary. So a standard can include all that, but that standard would then be used across the board. It can make things easier, especially for programmers or consumers, having a product that will have consistent results, usually. But open standards results can vary depending on how it's implemented, because there is some leeway. An open standard is not a specification in that a specification is very strict to here's the requirements, that's it. Outside the requirements, you're no longer in specification. But an open standard sometimes has some leeway in how it gets implemented and executed. And that's one of the arguments that a lot of the free software movements have, in saying, hey, you know, using the word open in this case shouldn't be warranted, and things like that. Now, the other thing that I would like to point out, as we could say as a negative, is one where Steve Jobs had talked about in that very same letter about features not being utilized by having cross-compilers, in that it creates a least common denominator. Well, open standards actually have the same effect as well, versus specialization. If a product is out there, or a company that can specialize in a product but yet yields to an open standard across the board, can forgive some of that specialization and thus losing it, i.e. that could be special features, so on and so forth. So in essence, whether one chooses to say that cross-compiling is bad in that regard, you can also apply that same negative to open standards. In the end, especially within the internet, open standards are a better way, at least in my opinion, to go. Especially having programmed on the internet for so many years, there was a tremendous amount of specialization in the beginning, and the advent of CSS and JavaScript getting used widely. But then there's also been other specializations, like Java being used, but it got implemented across the board, or ActiveX, which was solely parts of Microsoft's interactivity in trying to get more interaction and more powerful features on the web. Products like Flash, bringing many media powerful tools to the internet as well. An open standard, in the end, if the committee can agree a lot of times, because I can tell you, like, even in the creation of OpenGL Spec 3, there can be a lot of back and forth and arguing, and there can be companies' interests at stake if they hold patents that are part of those open standards. But usually having a consensus, it does keep technology at a certain level, which can have its cons if specialization brings advancement. However, if you want more products to move and have consistent results and make an easier time for developers, usually open standards are the better way to go. Anyway, I hope that answers the question about open standard versus open source. If you need more definitions about open source, I have a video that you can see right here. Thanks for watching.